I now call Michelle Thomson to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think we can all agree that the backdrop to this budget has been extremely challenging. We've got considerable uncertainties. We've talked about rapidly rising inflation, a cost of living crisis, energy price hikes and so on. And against this backdrop, we have to acknowledge the UK Government have added their own challenges for the Scottish Government with a constant changing of reliable consequential figures and fundamentally a lack of respect for this Parliament. The response of the UK Treasury to the wider economic conditions remains unclear, and the Bank of England started a process of regular interest rate rises, and although it's received little comment in this Parliament, it's setting out a path of unwinding quantitative easing. And the consequences of that no one can be certain of, I suspect, not least of all the Bank of England. And of course, this backdrop, which is very important for us to understand, of course leads to pressure to increase government expenditure on every front. And no area has been immune from these pressures. And we've heard today the multiple calls from across this chamber to raise department allocations and expenditure in virtually everything. But again, it cannot be overstressed that the Cabinet Secretary and her ministerial team face all these pressures with a largely fixed budget. And someone coming into this chamber the first time cannot understand why it's so hard for the opposition parties to understand this. The calls for increased expenditure are simply not matched by suggestions of where budget cuts should be made. And the opposition seem to imagine that there actually is a magic money tree after all. One further issue about which I've spoken before is the uncertainty and fast-changing forecasts with which the Scottish Government has to contend. The OBR forecast determine the size of the block grant adjustments for both devolved taxes and welfare benefits, and the SFC forecasts affect the tax revenues and welfare spending. And this is a headache, and more so if outcomes are significantly different from the forecasts and, as the Cabinet Secretary has already pointed out, with a limited ability to carry forward. So then, the question for me is, how should we judge the budget? And perhaps there is a test. Amidst this background and the challenges, has the Government come up with a balanced, fair and proportionate set of proposals? Furthermore, is there flexibility to allow for adjustments as circumstances evolve? And as a member of both the Finance and Economy Committees, I think the Cabinet Secretary and her ministerial team have done a quite frankly remarkable job to satisfy these tests. The scrutiny of the budget by the Finance and Public Administration Committee was detailed and thorough given the time and resources available. Our report identifies the importance and challenges of the fiscal framework and of the negotiations taking place. Amongst the evidence we examined, I was impressed by the paper Options for Reforming the Devolved Fiscal Frameworks Post-Pandemic, authored by the three Davids, Professor David Bell, David Phillips and David Iser. They argued persuasively for increased flexibilities in borrowing and reserve drawdowns in normal times. They also sought the reintroduction of funding guarantees and extended borrowing powers during times of rapid change and adverse shocks, such as we've been experiencing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Scrutiny of a budget can become dauntingly technical, but we cannot forget the need for transparency and clarity for the citizens of Scotland. Rather than asking about the intricacy of the fiscal framework, they might ask, probably encouraged by the media, why for 2020 to 2021 there was a £580 million underspend. And asked about this during an evidence session, the Cabinet Secretary responded with her typical clarity and candour. I quote, "It is illegal for me to overspend. Therefore, as we get closer to the end of the financial year, coming in under budget is a bit like landing on a 747 on a postage stamp." In other words, that is a function of a quite ridiculous process of how we need to manage our budget. And I have tweeted earlier today, you wouldn't run a business like this, so why are we expected to run our country like this? Now, I've already had my say on tax during the tax resolution debate. However, from some of the earlier comments from the Tories, I notice that the Tories still fail to pick up on the fact, as quoted last week by the Spotlight on Corruption report, that £290 billion every year is lost to UK GDP as a result of corruption. Last week, I called on Murdo Fraser to condemn that. He did not. Perhaps he might like to do that today.
Murdo Fraser.
An intervention.
That. Would you like to do that?
Well, would the member like to take an intervention or not?
I'd be delighted.
Murdo Fraser.
Would the member like to condemn all the wastage we've seen in the Scottish Government, which my colleague Liz Smith outlined in detail earlier in this debate?
Michelle Thomson.
Presiding officer, he's beginning to sound a bit like Boris Johnson and he won't condemn it. So allow me to close by reflecting an important aspect of expenditure. The budget for 2022 to 2023 gives emphasis to the importance of preventative spend across a range of areas, from health to the environment. And of course that's also related to the need for reform. And I strongly agree with the view of Professor Graham Roy when he told our committee that the resource spending review provides an opportunity to undertake a significant review of how public services are delivered. And he went on to say this would involve difficult choices, but that is ultimately what the government has to do. And in tackling such difficult choices amidst the current economic conditions, I commend the budget and congratulate the Cabinet Secretary and her team on their efforts on behalf of the people of Scotland. Thank you.